Pesticides by Brandy Larson. Our objectives are to identify the effect of pesticides with cancers and reproductive health, recognize proximity of farms to diseases, define the World Health Organization and the Environmental Protection Agency regulations, simplify the EPA risk assessments, summarize whether the good outweighs the bad, and apply new alternatives and solutions. Why did I select this topic? I grew up in rural Indiana, where every spring the small airplanes would fly over fields and drop pesticides and herbicides on acres and acres of corn and soybean crops. Typically, they did this on calm days, but you could still see the chemicals drifting on the wind. I lived in the country, but only about a mile, as the crow flies, to a landfill that also became a waste management site for hazardous chemicals. We had multiple neighbors on our road end up with cancers that, after doing the research for this class, I found that have direct links to pesticides and herbicides. Exposure possibilities to pesticides can include an occupational exposure, which would be those who work around pesticides, such as farmers, lawn care specialists, golf course, and vineyard superintendents. They increase their risk of cancer by performing these jobs. Our food and drinking water can be affected. However, this is minimal due to the regulations in place. Substantial exposure through the use of pesticides in the home is where most children obtain their biggest exposure risks. And the environment can become a factor if pesticides are not used properly, storms after an application, or if it's applied on a windy day. If not applied correctly, some pesticides can last a long time in the environment and become an increased risk factor for exposure. There have been linked numerous types of cancers to pesticides, but the top three are non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. A study was done that found an increased incidence of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in farmers and golf course superintendents, and the more acres involved, the higher the risk. Leukemia also had an increased incidence with farmers and golf course superintendents, but it was not as high as non-Hodgkin lymphoma. Certain tumor cancers also had an increased incidence with pesticide exposure. These tumor cancers were from the brain, kidney, pancreatic, and the prostate. Of note, I had 2 neighbors die from kidney and pancreatic cancer. Pesticides also have an increased risk of adverse effects on pregnancy and delivery. A study done on the pesticides in the rural population of the Ararat Valley of Armenia showed that when male workers were exposed to pesticides for longer than 10 days, their spouses had an increase in premature and stillborn deliveries. Women that were exposed longer than 10 days to pesticides had an increase in pregnancy complications as well as premature deliveries. Based on the data from the last 2 slides, we can see the correlation between the exposure to chemicals and cancer as well as adverse reproductive health. The closer a person is to the exposure, their chance of adverse effects increases. They have also found that the larger amount of acreage involved, the higher the incidence of cancer-related diseases. Generally speaking, the human exposure is more likely to happen directly from the source, not necessarily from our food or water sources. It can happen, but it's minimal. Some animal exposure is higher due to fields being sprayed. It can increase the human exposures as well, but it's only slight. This, however, does not include if there's a chemical spill into a waterway or another natural disaster situation. The World Health Organization has 2 objectives in relation to pesticides. Number 1 is to ban pesticides that are most toxic to humans, as well as pesticides that remain for the longest time in the environment. Number 2, to protect public health by setting maximum limits for pesticide residues in the food and water. The World Health Organization works with the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is the FAO, of the United Nations to maintain risk assessments for pesticide exposure from food. The joint meeting on pesticide residues includes the FAO and the World Health Organization. They determine risk levels and limits for safe food practices. This is based off scientific worldwide data and journals. This is to make sure that the consumption of pesticides over the course of a person's lifetime will not create detrimental health effects. These limits are set internationally, so no matter where you live, you can be assured that the level of pesticides in your food is standard across the globe. What is the Environmental Protection Agency's role in this? They are responsible for identifying potential health as well as ecological effects of pesticides through performing risk assessments not only on existing, but on new pesticides as well. There are two main types of risk assessments they perform: the ecological assessment and the human health assessment. The ecological risk assessment constantly tests the risk involved with pesticides. This is a four-step process. The planning phase is the beginning stages of a risk assessment. During this phase, research is conducted. Phase 1 is a determination of what plants and/or animals will be affected. Phase 2, if a plant or animal is affected, what level of exposure will be harmful. Phase 3 is the risk characterization. They do an estimation, which is findings and the effects from the exposure, and then they do the description, which is the level of exposure for harm. The human health risk assessment assesses the risk to humans from exposure to chemicals. Some of the following questions are asked. Are the legal limits set appropriate? Do social, economic, and health factors contribute to their risk? The type of pesticide and the length of exposure indicated? And what health problems are associated with this specific pesticide? The human health risk is also a four-step process. Step 1, identify the hazard and potential for harm. Step 2, assess the exposure and effects at certain dosages. Step 3, once encountered, how does the amount, length of time exposed, and number of times exposed calculate in the risk? And number 4, data analysis of the risk to the pesticide exposure. Strict data and testing guidelines are in place to ensure the accuracy of our findings. The United States, the European Union, China, and Brazil are the 4 main countries in the world that are the biggest users of pesticides. While the USA still allows the use of several pesticides, the other 3 countries have banned or phased out millions of pounds of pesticides annually. 2 of these nations have completely banned certain chemicals that the United States still allows. Why does the USA lag behind other countries when it comes to banning harmful chemicals in our pesticides? It's a tough question, but while we have strict laws and regulations in place, most of our bans come from a voluntary system by the company itself rather than the government. It's called a volunteer ban, and certain companies have stepped up and banned their own product or certain chemicals in their products. While it isn't a perfect system, it helps to put some of the responsibility on the company itself to keep their products under the governmental regulations. So what about the future? Utilizing genetically modified or GMO plants, biological pesticides, and omics technology. So using GMO for crop rotation with native and GMO plants can be beneficial. One of the drawbacks is that the plants develop a resistance and sometimes more pesticides are needed. The biological pesticides might be the best one yet. A biological pesticide is when a biological agent is used to control disease. These pesticides do not allow for a resistance to develop, and they are environmentally friendly. Omics technologies is a technology that allows for profiling of specific microbes on plants. Then scientists are able to create a solution for combating the diseased plant. I want to talk a bit more about microbial pesticides. These are used when chemical residues on vegetables is a concern. Using these can yield a bigger crop due to the increased health of the plant. This is an important replacement for chemical insecticides. We will probably see more and more of these types of products in the market for control of insects and weeds. Their pros are that they are safe, especially with organisms not intended for destruction. They're biodegradable, they are generally low cost to use, and they're suitable for pest management. But the cons are that they have a short shelf life and field residual, they can be difficult to utilize, and they do have inconsistent results. In conclusion, pesticides are considered a necessary evil. We need them to help control the infestations of weeds and insects for our food supply to be healthy. However, they have been linked to an increase in certain types of cancers. The strict regulations by the World Health Organization and the Environmental Protection Agency help ensure that the levels humans and animals are exposed to remain low and at tolerable levels. Advancements in genetically modified plants and microbial pesticides are helping to decrease the need for chemical pesticides. The hope in the future is that we will have advanced to the point of not needing to use chemicals at all and can rely on biological agents for weed and insect control. Thank you very much.